around your home to protest of fascism and racism. You promote hate that's led to an ideology that has led to thousands of people dying by the hands of the police, to trans women being murdered in the street.
I'd like to apologize in advance for anything I may say or do that could be construed as offensive as I slowly go nuts!
Recently, a bunch of totally peaceful protesters showed up outside Fox News anchor and host Tucker Carlson's place of residence while he was at work, to innocently inform him that they know where he sleeps.
We know where you sleep at night!
We know where you sleep at night!
The protesters accused Carlson of rhetoric that kills thousands of people. I mean, citation needed, but I, in contrast, have a whole hell of a lot of citations. But I was particularly perturbed by this event, mostly because outside of the insane invasion of privacy and very realistic threat it presents to his wife, who was at home, but particularly to his children who were not at home, but are obviously not innocents according to this lot, given their relationship to the vile Tuck, but also because the media was so quick to not only ignore it, but now even show outright support for it as just a quaint little gathering of a mere, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, we don't really know how many people, just playing a tambourine outside of his house, praying for peace, you know, despite the fact that they said they would be back when he least expects it. That they spray-painted an anarchist symbol on his driveway, supposedly cracked his door, according to Carlson, although this hasn't been confirmed, and confronted officers attempting to disperse them for illegally protesting. Yeah, you know, you have to have a permit for that. You got a license for that protest.
I've got a license for me pet dog, Eric, and I got a license for me pet cat, Eric.
You don't need a license for a cat.
You bleeding well do, and I got one. Oh, you're not catching me out there.
But I mean, come on, Aiden, they're just trying to stop this evil television personality from literally killing minorities with words. OMG, did you know that Richard Spencer likes him? I am literally shaking right now. That's after all why comedian, and put that in some quotations, Jabu Kamal Bell similarly said that Tucker Carlson more or less deserved what happened to him because he totally promotes hate. And yeah, that's why all of these blue check marks are dismissing it as nothing more than just some peaceful protesting, even suggesting that if it wasn't, he'd submit himself to Antifa for re-education anyway. After all, it's their right to harass people and damage property, as they proudly stated themselves. They're just protecting themselves and their rights from this vicious hatred, the horrible behavior of this man.
He's really asleep. I don't think we're being good co-hosts right now.
Good to see you. Welcome to Fox and Friends.
What a threat. Yet this man who restrained himself from actually assaulting another man, as caught on camera, after that man supposedly called his daughter a whore and a cunt. Yet we shouldn't believe Tucker Carlson's daughter because we only listen and believe when that's convenient to our side. Now don't we? Ah, how gallant of this gay Latino man to contact the creepy porn lawyer.
In the past, he's also demanded that we stop referring to him by a certain unflattering nickname. And we haven't agreed to that demand, but tonight, as a gesture of goodwill, we will not use that nickname. This is you at a
who so far has a really stellar track record on his win-to-loss ratio, to sue Tucker for not beating him up. Yeah, stunning and brave, stunning and brave. These are the kinds of warriors we're up against. I mean, look at this icon, emblematic of the resistance, who similarly stepped up to cuck the Tuck outside of his home. Truly a gender-fluid god among mere cis-normative mortals. Yeah, what a bunch of winners. Such bravery in the face of oppression. Yeah, right. Can you imagine if a bunch of tiki torch-wielding right-wingers showed up outside the home of Don Lemon after he so eloquently explained that he wanted to, you know, avoid making broad generalizations and engaging in identity politics and hatred by naming white men as persona non grata in US society?
So we have to stop demonizing people and realize the biggest terror threat in this country is white men, most of them radicalized to the right.
I mean, given his two-for status as both black and gay, which, by the way, in light of the prior statement, is kind of weird since he's married to public enemy number one. Can you envision the outrage that would have been plastered across the mainstream media if a similar thing had happened outside his home, with gleeful cries of, "We know where you and your butt buddies sleep"? Yeah, it would have been an international sensation rather than a tagline only being spoken about by a few conservative outlets and YouTube personalities. So outside of the fact that the left predominantly controls the mainstream narrative, why is this seen as acceptable or even normal at this point? Why is this the status quo? As of this Breitbart report, and you know Breitbart's extremely partisan, so take it with a grain of salt, there have been 639 acts of violence committed against or encouraged against conservatives and Trump supporters since the end of the 2016 election, including my state's own homegrown snake, Joe Manchin, recently saying he wanted to beat the crap out of a Republican opponent. Now, in his defense, and in Tucker's, they didn't actually beat the crap out of anyone. But Morrissey is just a political opponent. This guy called Tucker's daughter a whore and a cunt. If we assume even a fraction of these reports are legitimate, then we're looking at a far greater epidemic from violence on the left rather than violence on the right, which anytime any of this gets brought up, the left instantly and consistently points to as "Remember Charlottesville."
The accumulation of that, the retweeting of neo-Nazi videos, Charlottesville, I mean, I could go on and on.
Name three.
An event which in and of itself is less than clear-cut, as a self-proclaimed communist professor happily admitted that he aimed a firearm at the driver before he fled to his vehicle, which ultimately hit and killed Heather Heyer.
One time he paused right in front of me, and I waved him off with my rifle. In his last pass, he accelerated, and a block away, he killed Heather. I waved him off with my rifle.
But why is this okay? Could it have something to do with the fact that numerous left-leaning political leaders have outright called for it? From Hillary Clinton saying that there is no reason to even attempt to negotiate or communicate with us, the enemy, to anti-Maxine Waters calling for leftists to disrupt right-wing politicians wherever they find them. Seek them out and kill them wherever you find them. Making sense why the left's so fond of Islam now, innit? And which, by the way, they did. Going out and harassing numerous politicians, including Homeland Security Secretary Kristen Nielsen, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Trump advisor Stephen Miller twice, and most recently, Senator and known serial killer Ted Cruz at various restaurants as part of what Washington Post contributor Jennifer Rubin called a deserved part of their, quote, life sentence in recompense for working for Trump.
These people should be made uncomfortable, and I think that's a life sentence, frankly.
All actions which even Bill Mayer called out as stupid.
This is something Republicans understand way better than Democrats, that real power isn't about making a scene or what makes you feel good.
To crazy Joe Scarborough saying Trump is a bigger threat to America than the 9/11 hijackers.
Forget about running planes into the Pentagon. Those are tragedies, but those tragedies bring us closer together.
And so on and so forth ad nauseum. Or could there be something about left-leaning political ideology and personality intrinsically that is more conducive to radical behavior? Or is it possible that merely the current political state in which the left finds themselves, in a position of relative powerlessness, is the cause for all of this extreme action? Or is it, as with most things, a combination of multiple variables? Let's then look into the psychology of radical protest and political action. What makes a man rebel? I rebel. Or woman, sorry, don't mean to be sexist. This is already going to be a very long video, and while there are a lot of things I can get into here, most I will mention in passing. Generally speaking, though, the research on political protesting has been mostly concerned with several primary theories and topics, including expectancy value model, relative deprivation theory, social identity theory, research on authority and obedience, and personal logical differences. Let's then begin with a concept we've discussed many times before, social identity theory and its related constructs of uncertainty identity theory and self-categorization. The human psyche is a collection of various social identities which each and every one of us belong to, as well as individual factors that compose and comprise our sense of the self. This is a normal function of human existence and human evolution, as research from Dawes and Fowler 2009 have indicated a link between the strength of partisan attachment to a specific allele of the D2 dopamine receptor gene, which itself shows significant variance across races, I should note. But what that indicates is that group identity is part of our evolutionary background. As such, challenges to our sense of the self can present an uncertainty, which is psychologically uncomfortable and disconcerting. In most social situations, however, not all, we seek to reduce that uncertainty due to the discomfort that it elicits, and as such, it makes sense that uncertainty regarding the sense of the self is particularly unnerving, as after all, it is who we are. What causes this kind of uncertainty? Well, face threat often does. What is face threat? Let me use an example. Face threat might be something like being told repeatedly that your candidate was sure to win a couple years ago, and that a great tsunami was on the horizon to sweep across the nation for your team, due to the inherent rightness of your social identity and your politics. Only to be proven wrong, or at least have your hopes and aspirations deflated time and time again. That is a threat to identity. I made an entire video on that, so I'll cover this as quickly as possible. Uncertainty identity theory is typified by the following. It occurs when social identity is most salient to the sense of the self. That means that one's group affiliation overrides or supersedes one's individual proclivities. 2. Uncertainty is dependent on social context rather than individual differences. 3. That it presents in collective behavior and outcomes. And 4. That it motivates individuals in both extremist and non-extremist circumstances. We may reduce uncertainty by involving ourselves more heavily in a group. That allows us to bolster our uncertain personal identity with a group identity's stability, essentially replacing the me with the we in a process called depersonalization and self-categorization. Identifying with a group ameliorates uncertainty as identification furnishes associated prototypes. They prescribe behaviors. What are you supposed to do? Well, it's easy when I know how the group's supposed to behave, right? However, this may lead, in turn, to support of group extremism, when the norms of the group are extremist. For example, as Hogg, Meehan, and Farquharson 2010 found, university students who felt more uncertain about their identity were more likely to accept radical proposals regarding their school's tuition fees, and were more likely to engage in political action to support that ideology when they were more uncertain of their own individual identity. Again, replacing me with we. Kruglansky et al. Described extremist group identification as, quote, when they endorse central authority that sets uniform norms and standards, when they suppress dissent, when they shun diversity and show in-group favoritism, when they venerate their group's norms and traditions, and display fierce adherence to its views. Page 84. Shunning diversity of thought? I mean, that could describe any group, but I have one in mind. But further, as Hogg found in his 2012 review of uncertainty identity theory, quote, individual freedom creates uncertainty about what to do and who to be, and thus a yearning for moral absolutes embedded in groups circumscribed by powerful ideologies. These views are usually strictly policed by other group members because there is that necessity for intergroup adherence to group norms. Again, I can think of a group that describes currently, but hang on. Extant literature has thoroughly documented the kinds of groups that this applies to, in their relationship between societal uncertainty and various types of collective extremism. What are these groups? Well, generally speaking, they've been various types of totalist groups, cults, terrorists, fascists, ultranationalists, blind patriots, religious fundamentalists, authoritarians, ideological thinkers, and general fanatics. And while looking at that list, seems to be more predominantly oriented towards what we would politically call the right, right? Let's look into it. Kind of in contrast to what I just explained about uncertainty, extant research indicates that when reality is so repugnant to the sense of the self, rather than reduce uncertainty, that is to learn more, we may instead seek to increase uncertainty.
Would you like to know more?
Jost and Honeyday 2005 examined this in relationship to what's called systems justification theory, which describes a desire to maintain the status quo due to the interpretation of the status quo as morally just, and as such has been consistently correlated with political conservatism, meritocracy, Protestant work ethic, belief in a just world, fair market economics, and generally what we would call right-wing political ideology. The researchers found that people who believed in the justness of the extant system were more likely to attempt to reduce and manage their ideological uncertainty. This is consistent with Jost and colleagues' earlier meta-analysis of 12 countries with over 22,000 participants regarding conservatism in 2003, noting that general trait of systems justification was related positively to perceived instability in the system and negatively related to tolerance of uncertainty. That is, politically right-leaning individuals may seek to reduce their uncertainty, while people more on the left may seek to increase uncertainty, as greater uncertainty is related to more extreme collective action. Despite this, evidence indicates that for all groups, there is a tend toward extremism in the face of uncertainty, and as such, we still need to examine it in more detail. In keeping with my discussion of systems justification theory, Jost et al. 2011 examined just that in relationship to uncertainty identity theory and group salience across 3 studies, and found consistently that across all 3 groups assessed, being college students, Greek May Day protesters, and UK teachers, those who supported systems justification were less likely to be involved in protesting. That is, people who tended to believe in the status quo as being just, from a conservative standpoint, were less likely to participate in extreme political action through disruptive protesting. And interestingly, engagement in such disruptive events may in turn be encouraged through media primes attempting to reduce feelings of systems justification across a population. What do I mean by all of this? It's already getting complicated. In short, higher uncertainty, higher proclivity towards protest. Higher systems justification, lower uncertainty. Higher systems justification, decreased protest potential. What does it mean so far? It means if you believe in meritocracy and the other aforementioned concepts, you are just seemingly less likely to rebel through non-conventional political means. Further, the researchers found that feelings of rage and anger were negatively related to systems justification, but also positively correlated to peaceful protest in what they called the palliative effect of systems justification. So, we can see that maybe the rage of conservatives, while it still exists, is more related to normative or peaceful objections to a system rather than non-normative, radical ones. Regardless, the primary positive correlate with disruptive protesting in the model was none of those things, but was rather this: strength of group identity. Remembering again that group identity is affected by uncertainty. The more uncertain you feel, the stronger your identification may be under uncertainty identity theory. It seems that in terms of behavior, while left and right can both become radicalized in belief, when it comes to action, the left already looks a little bit more prone towards disruptive protest. But we have to look into that a lot more closely before we can make any kind of claims. Bean 1991 looked at the causes of political protesting, both benign and radical, in Australia, and found, similarly to the above, that the left tends towards extreme political protesting over the right. This manifests in a tendency of extremist protesters to be young anti-materialists, with a strong sense of ideology as central to the sense of the self. Strong political ideology and political partisanship were found in this study to be the 2 factors most strongly correlated to radical protesting, regardless of valence. But when we look at the other factors directing the foci of this protesting, it tends again to come from young post-materialists. And knowing that those on the right tend towards less active protesting via belief in systems justification, meritocracy, and fair trade, well, I think we're already starting to see some consistent data appearing here. Going back even further, and I apologize for the age of this study, but it is potentially still of value, Marsh 1974 identified a variable of protest potential within subjects toward various forms of collective action, including demonstrations, protests, boycotts, strikes, occupational activity, and violence, and found that not only did such a trait of protest potential seemingly exist, but it was particularly prevalent when it came to the acceptance of violent protest in students and was absent among the working class. Overall, protest potential was present in 30% of young workers and 48% in students. But very interesting here for us today, the correlations between the protest potential item and the other variables presented itself, with protest potential being correlated with ethnocentrism at a level of -0.4, and to lesser degrees, optimism at -0.18, happiness at -0.15, and Europeanism at -0.20. In contrast, protest potential was positively correlated with radicalism of any type at the level of 0.44, but also with post-materialism at the level of 0.37. That is, European values and ethnocentrism were negatively related to protesting, while in contrast there was a tendency of support for leftist ideology, including socialism or Marxism, in relation to potential for radical protest behavior. But why might this behavior come about? Well, uncertainty about the self pushes one towards group identity, and similarly, threat towards a sense of the self, and including the group sense of the self, influences one's behavior, particularly when it comes to group involvement in action and potentially protest. For example, Foster and Matheson in 1998 were interested in understanding personal discrimination and discontent with one's situation in the face of said discrimination, perceived or otherwise, in association with relative deprivation and subsequent interest in collective political action. In their analysis, the researchers asked female students to report their perceived discontent and levels of discrimination, as well as the frequency and extent to which they had recently engaged in protests and group action for feminist causes. In a kind of fascinating turn to what one might expect, while feeling discriminated against to a greater degree was related to more collective action, that was dependent on the level of discontent, but not in the direction you might think. It was instead that women who felt both discriminated against and personally emotionally affected by discrimination were in fact less likely to protest. Kind of interesting, isn't it, that the only women who don't appear to be negatively affected by their perceived discrimination are the ones who are willing to protest against said discrimination. Now, wouldn't you say? This is further reflected in Trop and Brown 2004's finding that women were more likely to support political action when they believed involvement in women's rights issues enhanced their own self-esteem or made them feel more important, rather than merely feeling that women were oppressed. That makes a lot of sense when we think about it, right? As those who may actually feel the ramifications of oppression, true oppression, are less likely to openly speak out about it in fear of the repercussions. Let's say, I don't know, women in Islamic Sharia-run countries. Hence perhaps why polling numbers also regarding support of Trump and Republicans have recently been so consistently inconsistent with reality. People are too afraid to speak their mind because when they speak their mind, you call them a Nazi and say it's okay to punch them or stand outside of their house and deface it. But that is, similarly to the above, people have to identify strongly, and they have to believe that they will receive some kind of reward, it seems, be it actual success in attaining political goals, or through self-enhancement. But maybe not all kinds of goals. Perhaps not, for example, actual monetary compensation for protesting, as Ginges and Atran 2009 found 90% of Palestinians were opposed to jihadist families receiving financial compensation for their behavior. However, I think we could argue that they probably think they're going to get some kind of compensation.
Recently, there was an article in the New York Times, the Quran scholar said the actual translation is not 71 dark-haired virgins, but 71 crystal clear raisins. Slight difference in interpretation, really? That's very strange, like finding out thou shalt not kill is thou shalt not wear a kilt.
Like a real man.
The researchers also did find in that study, and the precise measure that they used was not included in their analysis, so I'm a bit skeptical, that conservatism was the only factor related to greater support of jihad among Palestinians. But that's still far afield and far removed from American and Western conservatism, and is in a very highly emotional environment, the West Bank, where I should note that according to these data, it was 10% of Jewish participants who were willing to engage in violent behavior versus Palestinians at the level of 6.4%. Oy vey, please don't shut me down, I'm reporting your own data. This brings us into the question of emotion. Individuals' anger and feelings can have a role to play in group interaction and perception across all political leanings. As, for example, strong Democrats and Republicans reacted with greater anger to threatened electoral losses as illustrated by Huddy and Mason 2011 here. They found that strong partisans of either orientation were more likely than weak partisans to have engaged in political activities. Makes sense. But despite these similarities, one thing there is to note in the data, however, is that Democrats were significantly more likely to have participated in protests overall than Republicans or independents. Remember how I noted earlier that anger in those who believed in systems justification meant more traditional protests, not radical protests? Well, here we have findings that support that. as Republican political action was often negatively related to feelings of anger and anxiety, and in contrast was correlated in the opposite valence towards positive emotions across the various studies that were conducted by Huddy and Mason, although the presence of a threat did induce anxiety and anger in Republicans. In contrast, Democrat political action was generally unrelated to anger and anxiety, but was exacerbated by the fear of a threat in a negative direction. What this means is that while both Democrats and Republicans are politically evolved emotionally, Democrats are significantly more likely to protest and generally do not experience the same positive emotions and feelings related to their political identity and involvement that Republicans do. Still, both experience anger and anxiety when their identities are threatened. No duh. Part of the process, though, of engaging in collective action involves not only one's social identity be active and salient, but also that individuals perceive a material or symbolic threat to the sense of the self or the group. Again, face threat. I say this need only be perceived, as the threat often manifests in the form described by relative deprivation theory. Social groups can become politically active based merely on the interpretation or anticipation that certain members are being deprived in comparison to an outgroup in any imaginable number of ways. You only need really think you're being oppressed. For example, though, Kinder and colleagues 1989 examined the impact of perceived common economic interest on voting behavior and found that Americans who felt a strong sense of economic interdependence with other Americans, such as the elderly, farmers, the middle class, who all saw their group situations as deteriorating, were more likely to rate the economy negatively and vote on that basis with a sense of common fate, working in conjunction with a sense of economic grievances to promote a political cohesion that didn't necessarily connect people on any other level. All they had in common was their economic status. That was perceived of as deprived. Deprivation thereby increases and potentially even allows for the creation of group identification, and that group identification, as I think I've made clear, is an important element of protest potential. Specifically, as Abrams and DeMora 2002 found that strong identification with a student identity was necessary as a first step over any other variable, including relative deprivation, to impact the likelihood of a student to protest. High group identity, in conjunction with perceptions of relative deprivation, in that study accounted for 65% of the variance in proclivity to strike against the university after it raised housing costs across students. Interestingly, perceived relative status in contrast to other groups, particularly when the self is interpreted as part of a lower group and discriminated against, has numerous effects on the self outside of just this, across not just behavior, but also in mind and body. Sheepers and Elmer's 2005 measured blood pressure across participants assigned to a group with a high or low status, who were then told that their status could change in a second round of the study. Those in the low status group experienced an increase in blood pressure, while blood pressure decreased among those in the high status group. Foster 2000 indicated that women who claimed to experience personal discrimination were more likely to report having anxiety and depression, in addition to being more likely to participate in collective action, in protesting in general. The persistent nature of feeling discriminated against, or relatively deprived, is of particular import in these effects. As Townsend and colleagues 2011 found, women who were rejected from a position for being too reportedly emotional only experienced increased rates of stress and cortisol levels when they believed sexism was endemic to their society. Moreover, Jackson, Kuzbansky, and Wright 2006 posited a lifelong model of perceived discrimination and its effect on physical health as well. Given the long-term stressors that lead to greater anxiety and depression, as I mentioned, can affect the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis and subsequently cause an imbalance in brain chemistry, including levels of glucocorticoids and catecholamines, subsequently leading to an increased risk of autoimmune, inflammatory, and cardiovascular disorders. Thus, we can see that there are some significant effects in the body, in addition to the sense of self, which originate from feeling that one is being oppressed by an outgroup. But what about more radical political action directly? The answer may lie in a greater understanding of this relative deprivation theory, which was laid out seminally by Gurr in 1970.
Gurr, reporting for duty.
Gurr? What does the G stand for?
I don't know.
Who defined the concept as, quote, perceived discrepancy between men's value expectations and their value capabilities. Value expectations are the goods and conditions of life to which people believe they are rightfully entitled. Value capabilities are the goods and conditions they think they are capable of attaining or maintaining. given the social means available to them. Page 13. Essentially, much of RD can be surmised as an incongruity between expectations and reality, what one receives versus what one believes is due. As explained in the title of the seminal work, Gurr believed that the relative positioning of power explained why men rebel. Smith et al. 2016, in a meta-analysis of research on the theory, provide the following model, illustrating how beliefs in disparity between groups and fairness may manifest in states, beliefs, and behaviors of all aspects of human life. Specifically, though, we can see how despite relatively small effects overall of perceived relative deprivation across their analysis of 210 studies and 186,000 respondents, these effects were mostly prominent when it came to stress and anxiety, and in group behavior to a much lower degree, forwarding some positive attitudes and group behavior being affected. But there is a lot of seemingly conflicting information across this meta as to how relative deprivation manifests in behavior. So let's look instead to a few specific studies to see if we can understand this more. Noting that this most recent meta-analysis finds only spurious support for the entire theory, and that for this reason it has been largely abandoned in the modern social sciences, at least since the late 80s. Perhaps, though, because no one has yet identified the specific conditions under which it does appear to occur, and hence why many of these studies are so dated. That being said, get those pencils ready, folks.
Peggy Hill is down to her last pencil. She has no more pencils in reserve. Pencil.
Because I think I have a hypothesis, and if you feel like getting a PhD in sociology, political science, or social psychology, you might just want to take it and run with it. It's yours. Taylor, Moghaddam, Gamble, and Zellerer, 1987, placed Canadian students into a group of low-value decision-makers and suggested that through good, hard work, they might advance to a higher, more valued group, which would receive higher monetary reward for participation, and then summarily denied all participants access to the superior group. They found that participants were most likely to report wishing to engage in communal protest and action when their situation was perceived of as unjust, both distributively, in that they were given poor instructions, and procedurally, in that they were told they would be judged based on gender or personality fit to the higher value group. In contrast, justice and injustice were relatively equal in their influence on reports of individual protests. A second study found that collective action was particularly frequent in the low-status group members who believed that they were very close to becoming members of the high-status group. Well gee, why might it be then that leftists have become so prone towards violent collective action when Democrat leaders and the legacy media tell them over and over again things like, Hillary is a shoo-in, the midterm elections are gonna be a blue tsunami, only to wind up seemingly upset again and again, with, against all of their perceived odds, Donald Trump becoming the president, and with more of a blue, small tidal swell than a wave. Additional research from Wright, Taylor, and Moghaddam, 1990, included an additional variable of potential for access to the high status, being capacity for acceptance ranging between completely open to completely restricted, and found the propensity for support of collective non-normative behavior, that's violent protest, was most likely in instances where the entry to the high status group was closed off, both when participants thought they might be able to potentially breach it, and when they thought they were very far from breaching it. Thus, it kind of explains why it doesn't matter if you know that even if a blue wave happens, you still can't impeach Trump. You don't have that capacity. It doesn't matter. The protests are still going to happen under these conditions. But speaking of which, rather than looking at these invented experimental social groups, we really need to look at more natural experiments and examinations of existing groups for greater external validity. Crawford and Nadic, 1970, again very old, sorry, found that black people who believed they had no internal locus of control over their position in United States society were more discontent with that position and were considerably more likely to support violent protest. Makes sense. They were more likely to participate in peaceful protests when they perceived of, though, a higher internal locus of control. Do you see why this makes sense? If you think you don't have any ability to really affect your condition and your lot in life, you're more likely to become politically violent. Grant and Brown, 1995, had dyads of women construct memos to petition for higher pay for themselves, and were either deprived or permitted this increase in payment based on emotionality or rationality of their appeal. The results were such that women were more likely to suggest collective action and protest in response to perceived unfair payment than those who believed that they had not been deprived. However, This effect was particularly exacerbated by discussion with other women about the unfair nature of the decision. In other words, they only started to get riled up when they all gossiped about it. It also manifested in women from the deprived condition expressing greater dislike of females who received higher payment and higher positions, engaging in often derogatory speech towards the women who were in that higher status group, particularly when the disenfranchised group felt angry or threatened by the higher status females. This finding was further reflected in Foster and Matheson in 1995, who identified a trend across women who felt deprived as a combination of personal and group-related dissatisfaction as more likely to engage in collective protest behavior only when their personal ego was similarly threatened, in addition to their group identity being threatened. This indicates again the importance of perception of not just group oppression, but personal dissatisfaction to a mere mild and not extreme degree, predicting resulting group action and collective behavior. As I mentioned, research on relative deprivation theory is often conflicting, as Newton, Mann, and Geary in 1980 found across Australian farmers attending a political rally, those whose economic situation had recently devolved when they had expected it to improve were as likely to support militant activity in protest as farmers who reported no deprivation. This may be further explained in this study by Abrams and Grant 2012, who found that while collective and personal perceived deprivation were consistently positively related to intention to vote for the Scottish Nationalist Party, it was only slightly related to people becoming more involved in political action. The general variable of political engagement was a considerable greater correlate to engagement, to actual action, than anything else, than any perceived deprivation. Thus, we seemingly have very conflicting data, but could it be that the anemic nature of relative deprivation theory is a result not of the theory's inaccuracy, but rather in group differences between left-leaning and more right-leaning political movements forwarding different results? After all, right-leaning individuals, as we have learned, tend to be greater believers in a just world. They tend to support systems justification. They believe that outcomes are deserved. They tend to be high in conscientiousness, as we've seen from existing data on the Big Five, with an adherence to duty and order. And finally, they tend to value obedience to authority and self-sacrifice as moral foundations. In contrast, more liberal or left-leaning individuals tend to less commonly believe in a just world, just as they tend to be more extroverted and open to new experience via the Big Five, and generally are morally more concerned with perceived fairness of outcomes. Is this starting to make sense why we see this discrepancy in relative deprivation theory? If you don't get what I mean, this is what I think it means. If I'm right, and I have some decent reasons to believe that I am, as I've just noted, I think I just solved the problem of the spurious data regarding this theory. That being that right-leaning and left-leaning political movements are disparately affected by perceptions of disenfranchisement. The left externalizes in revolt, the right internalizes through procedural behavior. Take this, my friends, take this hypothesis and test the hell out of it. I swear, if you can actually isolate this, if you can isolate the importance of political leaning, measured through self-report, belief in a just world, systems justification, Protestant work ethic, nationalism, anti-materialism, Europeanism, moral foundations, and various other personality factors, you can publish a dang doctoral thesis on this that would be very, very thorough. It further makes sense, though, given the interest and support for relative deprivation theory in the study of left-leaning civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s being seemingly very common, but then absent, or at least minute, in more conservative or nationalist movements that were assessed years later when the theory began to be dropped. Well then, congrats, again, whoever takes this and runs with it all the way to the dean's office, because I think I just gave you an answer to a 40 or 50-year-old question regarding a now mostly abandoned theory. Woo! But thus far, we looked at the impact of social identity on protest potential, further for social identity's impact on perceived relative deprivation on behavior towards collective action, and as such, we've seen that left-leaning political identities may be more likely to protest in general, and minority groups which are concerned with these more left-leaning ideas of justice and fairness over conservative ideas of work ethic and meritocracy are similarly more likely to support collective action. Are there any other possible rationales for this behavior that we see predominantly coming from the left in the current year? We have Clanderman's 1984 expectancy value model. Clandermans posited two methods of behavior in this model: consensus mobilization and action mobilization. In consensus mobilization, the group attempts to familiarize members with their objectives, gain support for those objectives, and thereby encourage group beliefs. Action mobilization is not so much based on informing, but is rather a process of persuasion whereby the group motivates members, or as Clandermans states, converting sympathizers into participants via individual belief stimulation. This was illustrated in Clanderman's analysis of Dutch trade union disputes, finding that union members were more likely to participate when they believed that many members would take part, and that fellow workers would be positive about participation, and believed objectives would thereby be successful. In other words, people are more likely to engage in radical protest when they think that that protest will be looked upon favorably by their peers. Well, right now, what's more popular than radical protests among the left? You better protest, because if you're not screaming Orange Man bad, well then you're just not doing your part, right? Now, there is also the potential of leaders and authority figures to influence individual action. Given what we know about the impact of authority on behavior, as was evident seminally through Stanley Milgram's work on obedience, we know that the potential exists. But in the field of political activism specifically, we have more evidence to look at in detail, with, for example, the work of Nilsson and Nilsson 1980, who found the potential for protesting was most strongly related to challenging authority figures, and with a distrust in political hegemony. This further explains why we may see so very little non-conventional or radical right-wing political action, given conservatives tend to, via moral foundations theory, be more likely to value authority and conscientiousness. Further, when we consider the manner in which the left currently positions itself as outliers, dissidents, with leftist leaders as radicals fighting for freedom, then can we properly apply these findings to the present zeitgeist? After all, the left is rebelling against the institutional power, despite the great power themselves controlled by the left and their degree of influence over the media and Silicon Valley. Trump is president, and thus they can seemingly dismiss all evidence to the contrary. And who people on the left view as legitimate in their authority is also seemingly based on some level of identity politics. Hence, perhaps further, why despite their own institutional power, people like Ocasio-Cortez and Maxine Waters maintain their popularity, as group identification has a significant impact on political voting. Huddy and Carey, 2009, found in their analysis of the 2008 political presidential election that black people of both genders rated race as one of the most important, if not the most important factor in their vote for Obama, as well as both white and Latino women rating gender as an important factor in why they voted for Hillary Clinton. But with either race or gender noting an important factor being identity politics in either candidate across Democrat voters exclusively of any demographic. So, particularly when leftist media outlets, despite their ubiquity, attempt to portray themselves as outliers, minorities, then it makes sense why rebellion continues to occur across the left, despite the seeming evidence that their respect for authority is negatively correlated to political action. They paint themselves as dissidents, as rebels. They're not the authority figures. These ancient neoliberals, they're the freedom fighters. Given we've now seen that left-leaning social identities, relative disadvantage, political authority, and expectancy value models may all explain why we see these outrageous protests, what could possibly be left to explain these findings? Well, friends, there's still one major factor to consider. What is the effect of the media on all of this? McLeod in September 1999 sought to examine the potential of media exposure on political action by exposing students to 3 different news broadcasts concerning self-proclaimed anarchists protesting against the government, with the low support for the status quo broadcast interviewing protesters and noting that the police used mace against them, the medium support for status quo condition explaining the general purpose of the anarchist protest and that not all of them were involved in violence, but also mentioning that they had conflict with the authorities and some minor editorializing, and with the high support for status quo segment being predominantly focused on violence against the police, highly critical of the protesters, and included images of flag burning, with the reporter castigating protesters saying, quote, "It's easy for these kids to be against everything because they are not involved in anything." Students were then asked about their opinion toward the protests and protesters. Generally, students who supported the status quo, system justification, more conservative, were critical of the protesters and did not personally identify with them. Across the media conditions, however, opinions towards the police and belief that the protests were not popular were higher in those who watched the medium and high support of status quo broadcasts. Conversely, the protest was seen as more effective and newsworthy in the lower support broadcasts and segments. In other words, yes, media framing of a protest can have an effect on how we think about that protest, based in part on existing support of the status quo. Well, remember now, the current status quo across the media is left biased in its orientation, and we have seen the mainstream news use these very tactics numerous times over the last 2 years. After all, every single time something like what happened the other night to Tucker Carlson occurs, or a group of Antifa show up and start throwing punches or bike locks, time and time again, Don Lemon and his ilk show up on CNN and MSNBC to remind us to remember Charlottesville and the epidemic of right-wing violent protests. Again, citation needed. The talking heads spun for months and still occasionally wind themselves up into a tizzy all over again just because Trump took a medium support route of saying there were good people on both sides. Meanwhile, Donny Boy and his pals talk about Antifa standing up against tyranny, right? Well, how does that frame things? Much like with relative deprivation, the position of protesters within the media seems in part reliant on just what is the status quo. It is dependent on the current cultural gestalt of the accepted political norms. For example, in his book, fascinating to put in a modern sort of context or perspective, The Whole World is Watching, Mass Media in the Making and Unmaking of the New Left, Amazon link below as always, Dr. Todd Gitlin thoroughly discusses the media's obsession with the powerful, newsworthy images associated with radical protests of the 60s and 70s, but how the media's short love affair with this interesting topic became quickly highly critical of their actions as these actions became at odds with the existing societal norms at the time, with the New Left movement being heavily based in Marxist philosophy but simultaneously rejecting the grand narrative or unifying theories of Marxism being the springboards now of much of what currently defines our cultural zeitgeist. Feminism, rejection of gender roles, emphasis on LGBTQIAA whatever, and other identity politics. That's where this comes from. As I said, it's quite interesting to put it into context, as Dr. Gitlin states, quote, "By simply doing their jobs, journalists tend to serve the political and economic elite definitions of reality. But there are disruptive moments when the routines produce news that no longer harmonizes with the hegemonic ideology. At these critical moments, political and economic elites are more likely to intervene in journalistic routine, attempting to keep journalism within a harness. Noting these conflicting forces of cultural change, media and authority having produced a radical shift towards the political right with the Chilean coup d'etat of 1973. Gitlin also notes how media portrayal of the New Left protests not only potentially affected public portrayal and opinion of the movement, but how the movement's opinions and behaviors towards themselves and their own members were altered. After all, if Don Lemon praises Antifa as warriors of freedom against fascism and normalizes the destruction of innocent trash cans everywhere, then that behavior kind of similarly becomes potentially viewed as part of what it means to be part of the left in the current year. I am not, nor was Gitlin, I believe, himself a prolific scholar of social psychology, suggesting a hypodermic needle effect of media exposure, but rather that small media effects can alter public perception both internally within and externally without a political group. Moreover, it is important to note how this has changed since Gitlin's writing of the New Left movement, as McLeod, 2007, found in his analysis of media coverage of the Day Without Immigrants protesters being largely reported positively by the media, even now over 10 years ago. And the author speculates that this was largely in part because Hispanics at that point comprised a significant portion of the media's demographic base. Thus, when something has become the social norm, protesting in line with the status quo is reported on positively. Meanwhile, as Shoemaker in 1984 found, there was little difference in the frequency at which the media tended to report on protests, only the valence to which they described these protests, with groups that were more deviant from cultural norms, such as the KKK and neo-Nazis, being significantly reported of more negatively in their descriptions and were spoken about as illegitimate in nature. Although that sure hasn't changed, it indicates that the relative nature of coverage, now with any conservative political ideology being equated with Nazism after all, is relative. Thus, standing in front of Tucker Carlson's house and making threats against him and his family is seen of as a legitimate form of protest based on our current hegemony. Your term, not mine. But anything the Proud Boys do, that is terrible, evil, and awful, all because of status quo positionality. We've learned a lot about why men and women engage in support of radical, non-normative protesting and political action. From group identification and face threat, to relative deprivation, to rejection of formal authority figures, to media exposure. And while I've mentioned some of the personological differences here throughout, let's end by describing them in more detail. DeGrazia 2014 looked at individual differences in engagement in conventional and non-conventional political action and found that full-time employment was actually negatively related to any kind of political activity. Although previous literature had found it was more negatively related with unconventional protest, DeGrazia's sample was similar across both kinds, conventional and non-conventional types of action. Distrust in political establishment was related to both forms of protest, as was strong ideological commitment. All things we've seen so far. However, the author notes that unconventional protest was almost exclusively left-wing and liberal in nature. Being white and more highly educated was related only to conventional political action, while being female was negatively related to conventional political action. Women, minorities, and those without a higher education, described as disadvantaged by the author, were twice as likely as the privileged, that is, white college-educated men, to engage in radical political protesting. In terms of what the author calls enthusiasm, defined as those who distrust authority and are predominantly liberal, with low enthusiasm being described as predominantly conservative, highly enthused liberals were more than 54 times as likely to be involved in unconventional radical political protest and behavior than the low enthusiasm conservatives. 54 times as likely. And that's consistent with research going back decades, as Mueller, in an interesting analysis now turned timepiece in 1972, noted not only greater support among black people over whites for extremist groups such as Black Panthers and the socialist-aligned Students for Democrat Society and Black Islam, but that race, black, and age, being younger, were also related to greater potential for political violence. Again, something we've seen earlier. The authors ultimately concluded that readiness to engage in revolution against the state will be greatest when there's a very low degree of political trust in authorities, combined with a very high degree of belief that the use of violence has been useful in the past, in addition to these racial or minority components. Further information on personality differences beyond what I have described above were specifically examined in relationship to propensity for protest in former citizens of East Germany in the early to mid-1990s by Brandstatter and Ock, 2014, who found a negative relationship with agreeableness and neuroticism, and a positive relationship with reciprocity orientation, a variable itself related to extroversion and neuroticism, and openness to experience most strongly, explaining 35% of the variance in proclivity towards protesting when the analysis included latent constructs related to protesting. Conscientiousness, the one personality variable most related to conservatism, was unrelated to this potential. Have I started to paint for you a pretty clear picture of why it's seemingly okay for Tucker Carlson to be harassed? Why it's okay for him to be attacked? Why Antifa is often lauded and the Proud Boys demonized? And what kind of people are most drawn to this kind of radical behavior? Distrust in authority, minority status, be it perceived or realistic, support of liberal political ideas and identification as a Democrat, high openness and belief in fairness as a moral foundation, and similarly, reciprocity orientation, strong identification of one's political group and belief in relative deprivation of that group in contrast to an outgroup, but similarly, feelings of not being quite too discriminated against, and having something to gain from the involvement with a political orientation or action, and only when that associated political action is left-leaning rather than more conservative. All of these things now define the psychological, behavioral, and trait-like profile of the radical protester. Did I just spend almost an hour telling you something that is seemingly completely obvious? Yeah, I probably did, as always. But we need to see the data. I can't just come out here and say, hey, this is happening because leftists are just more prone to this or that behavior. I have to show you why they are as such. I have to show you the information. combined with a media which supports and informs these actions as normative, and leaders that paint themselves as dissident in order to play the part of the never-ending revolutionary, that is where we position and find ourselves, with the left openly threatening right-wing politicians and pundits, silencing actual dissenting opinions, such as the likes of Alex Jones, regardless of what you think about him, and outright engaging in violence, such as was the case with Steve Scalise, with a scant word from the mainstream media. Well, a psychopath, sending alarm clocks through the mail, and the tiki torch touting Unite the Right still being constantly referenced as proof that it's really the right-wingers who are the violent ones, it's really them. Pay no attention to the weekly left-wing freakout or active calls for extreme action behind the media curtain. Just ignore that. Don't you remember Charlottesville? I do. Just like I hope that you remember the now countless incidences of leftist violence over the last few years. And any right-wing ones that happened as well. And I hope, friends, that I've started to paint this picture for you. I've started to show you why this is the case. Regardless, hopefully we now have a little bit more of an idea either way, right? We understand a little bit more about what we're looking at. Why all of this is potentially happening. It's, as with many things, in part due to major differences in personality between left and right, yes, but it's also based on political positioning, relative perceptions of power, and of a victim mentality. This is a complicated, multivariate issue, as most things are. But if you've ever wondered why the left seemingly gets a pass to be so aggressive, and more importantly, why they're so politically aggressive, I think I've provided some answers. What do you think, though? Is this division based on personality, morality, and individual differences? Are those individual differences the basis themselves of group differences, and thereby group identity and ultimately group-related action? Is the right really the new counterculture, as Paul Joseph Watson seems to claim, or is this in fact actually nothing new, but rather a long-term difference between general groups of people? Let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this very long video, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, all time of old.